Welcome to a very special Twilight Zone podcast. It's not the episode that everyone's been expecting, but every now and again an opportunity gets presented to you that you just can't ignore, and this is one of those opportunities. We haven't really touched upon the 80s series of the Twilight Zone in the podcast yet. That's something for the future when we're finished with the original series, but like I say, I got an opportunity recently to speak to one of the men heavily involved in the 80s series, and it was just too good an opportunity to pass up. So what better way of introducing the 80s Twilight Zone to the podcast than this? Paul Chitlik was the story editor on the Twilight Zone, along with his writing partner Jeremy Bertram Finch. Now, they did contribute an episode to the second series of the 80s Twilight Zone called Aqua Vita, but then they went on to write several more and to actually story edit the show into the third season. Now, several of those scripts that Paul and Jeremy wrote are now being released on ebook by a company called Digital Fabulists, and you can go and check them out at digitalfabulists.com. And to celebrate that, I got the chance to have a chat with Paul, and I'm going to play that for you right now. A word of warning, we do spoil probably 3 episodes, and those episodes are Aqua Vita, The Trunk, and Room 2426. So if you haven't seen those episodes, maybe you want to catch those first before listening to the interview. But anyway, without further ado, here's Paul Chitlik. Paul, I guess a good place to start would be, could you maybe tell us about before you ever came to work on the 80s show, what was your introduction to the Twilight Zone?
Well, my connection with that was as a viewer,
Uh-huh.
and it's pretty religious viewing for me at the time. And also, I had a great experience with one of those shows. I watched it with my brother, my younger brother, as a matter of fact, and we were watching a show called To Serve Man,
Yeah.
which I think I mentioned that before, but this was a show in which an alien comes from another world, and he brings a book that the United Nations interpreter finally discovers, breaks the code of the title at least, and the title is To Serve Man. So everybody thinks, wow, they're great. They've come here to help us. And the aliens begin a process of making promises to people, taking them back to their world and telling them that everything is going to be great over there. And then near the end of the show, the interpreter runs to the United Nations with the results of his further investigations and finds out that it's a cookbook.
Of course,
And,
yeah.
and then we cut to where the guys are on the alien ship, and they're just being fed enough scraps to keep them alive so that they could be served as food on the alien planet. Well, this scared the crap out of my brother, who was at the time, I don't know, 7 or 8. And it scared me pretty well too, but not nearly as much as it. He convinced me, thinking that people could be food for aliens. So I was always fascinated with the Twilight Zone. The ideas that it took simple ideas and spun them out into something that would be scary, delightful, thoughtful. I remember another one about plastic surgery where we never saw the face of the person, was the central character, but everybody else in the world was ugly, and so you assumed that things were going to change for her. And she went in for plastic surgery, and the reason that she did was because she was beautiful, and they wanted to make her. She wanted to be like everybody else.
Yeah.
It was a very interesting idea that explored the reasons for what we do on Earth, and what we do in our daily lives, but we spun it out into something a little bit more thought-provoking. When I saw that they were starting it up again, I thought, I've got to try that. I've got to get in there. And I was just at that time getting into television. I had been a writer and a college administrator and a teacher up to that point, but I'd never written for television. And I had started working on a show called Guilty or Innocent, and I'd written for that for a while. And then the opportunity came to pitch to Twilight Zone, which actually was an opportunity I created by going onto the lot where CBS was developing Twilight Zone.
Yeah.
The Studio City Radford lot. And we just wandered around a lot. looking for the Twilight Zone offices, and we found it. At that time, it was a lot easier to get on the lot. We lied our way on, of course, but at that time, it was a lot easier to get on the lot. And we went to the Twilight Zone office, and Harlan Ellison was sitting in the reception area.
Yeah.
And we started talking to him, and he's an incredible science fiction writer.
Mm.
And he was very casual, and he said, "Hey, are you guys coming to the Writers Guild picnic on Saturday? We're going to be talking about how to pitch to the show." And we, who were not members of the Writers Guild at the time, said, "Yeah, of course, sure. What time are you going to be there?" And he told us. So we went home and called up the Writers Guild and said, we lost the notice for the picnic on Saturday. Where is it going to be?" And they told us, and so we went to the picnic with dates, as a matter of fact. And we met with Harlan and Rocco Bannon and George Martin and several other people there who have now, of course, gone on to produce really big shows.
Yeah.
And we got the word, and then they invited us in to pitch, and we went to pitch, and that's how we sold our first episode.
Which was Aquavita, right?
Which was Aquavita, yeah. We sold them another one after that, but they never made it. I don't remember the name of it right now, but obviously they never made it, so it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
And then when the show went off the air for a while, and then there was a notice in the LA Times, of all places. I mean, you'd think everybody would know what was happening, but it was published in the LA Times that they were going to be starting up again, and Mark Schommerding was going to be the executive producer. Mark was a guy that had worked on Claudius. I don't know if you know him, but it was...
of course, yeah.
Yeah, great show. Very, very interesting. Fascinating show, as a matter of fact. So, like the brash young men that we were, we called him up. I just called up Mark. I don't know how I found him, but I called him up and I said, "Hey, we'd like to pitch to work on your show." And he said, "Oh, yours was one of the few episodes that I really liked of the CBS version of Twilight Zone. So why don't you come in?" So we talked to him, and he hired us as story editors. Us meaning me and Jeremy Bertrand Finch, who was my writing partner at the time. So that's how we got on. And then the other story editor was J. Michael Straczynski, Joe Straczynski, and we all worked together to decide what stories were going to go on that particular version of Twilight Zone. We had 30 stories to work with, and we decided to use a lot of freelance writers, or as many as we could. And Mark was the executive producer. He sat in on story meetings. Not story meetings, he sat in on pitches, and he would have the final word, but really it was Joe and Jeremy and I that decided what was going to go on the show. There was nobody between us and Mark. And we would have had the title of producer had we not been shooting in Canada, and there were requirements to have a certain number of people on the cast and crew that were Canadian, and producers was an off-limits title for Americans. So.
I see.
That's what we did. It was cool.
Well, if we could go back to that first episode, Aquavita, I think it is it is one of those episodes that I watched, and it did harken back a lot to the original series because, it had at its centre a very kind of human fear that we all face, the fear of getting old, and then it had an element of the unexplained getting introduced to that, which is a very Twilight Zone way of telling a story. I mean, how much was the original show in your mind when you and Jeremy were sitting down to write that one?
That one came in, we pitched that episode. So that one came about because I was walking down the boardwalk in Venice, and I saw some young women in bikinis, which is always interesting, and I saw an old woman in bikini. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. And we started to talk about this. And this is usually the way Jeremy and I came up with ideas. One of us had seen something, heard something, thought something, dreamt something. And we'd start talking about it. And I said, well, what if, the guy that's walking here really enjoyed the company of this older woman, this older bikini woman, but he knew that, there would never be anything between them, but why not? And then I thought, well, what if she were a younger person in that body? And what if there was something that she could take that would make her younger? So the idea came that you could drink something. There would be Fountain of Youth and bottled water. And then we got it transposed, and we talked to the guys at Twilight Zone. We pitched it like that. And then in the room, we decided that it might be better if it was an aging model, if the person that was going to become younger had a reason for that rather than the person that was talking to her.
Yeah.
So we decided it might be a model. And then through our discussions, we decided really maybe it's better if she was a anchor person for the news. And we follow the precepts of the Twilight Zone there, which is put an ordinary person in an extraordinary situation and see how they act. We also had in mind as we were writing this that it was a metaphor for drug use, especially cocaine, which makes you feel younger, I've heard, and that, but actually ages you if you become an addict. Now, this is certainly the case with methamphetamine, and you feel younger, but you age much faster. So that is why we got the idea that if she stopped taking the drug, she would age.
Right.
And age more than what she was, her true age, her true chronological age. And then we started to think about, well, what would make this really interesting, not just as one person, but her relationship with her, at that time, boyfriend. Could have been her husband, could have been anything, but was her boyfriend. How would that affect their relationship? Again, the interior person is the same, it's just the exterior that's different, and we wanted to understand how that would work. And that's when we came up with the twist, which was the twist of the love story, which I have to admit got a little bit screwed up in the shooting of it and the editing of it. We had specifically said, do not show these people sitting there and talking, so that it's more of a reveal and a surprise when we cut to them and we see they're both old.
Right.
Show the young couple in the distance, shoot over the shoulder if you have to here, but don't show the older people in VO. I mean, who are talking. We wanted it just to be VO and then to come back and show them in person. So anyway, that's the genesis of that idea and how it turned out. It's interesting how an idea changes as you continually talk about it, especially a Twilight Zone idea. They continually changed as we tried to go deeper and deeper into the characters and their motivations and their relationships.
That was your first episode, and then, like you said, you and Jeremy went on to be story editors. Now, I haven't seen those first 2 seasons. What were your thoughts on what had been done so far, and how did that shape what you guys wanted to do with the series going forward?
Well, we were in agreement with Mark Shelmerdine, and actually Joe came on board on this idea too, was that we wanted to go back to the original Twilight Zone concepts. Phil DeGuerre had kind of wandered off and done some different kinds of things, and the focus wasn't really there. Again, we wanted to do ordinary people in extraordinary situations.
Yeah.
And he had done all kinds of crazy stuff, including there was one thing where everybody was, there was kind of an organization that took care of each moment in time and had to redress a room every so many seconds to make it look like time was passing. And it was a concept I don't even understand today, but it was so complex that they actually got out a blackboard and explained it during the episode, and writing formulas and things like that. So we didn't want to do anything like that because that was too confusing. It was not readily understandable to a wide audience. And, we wanted to focus on people, their relationships, and how the extraordinary situation affected those people and those relationships, which is, what really good drama should be doing.
Absolutely.
And so we all decided we would go back to the Rod Serling era for inspiration in terms of style and content, and then update it in terms of what's possible now. And then, of course, if there's anything that went into the future, we could do that as well. So we had a wide range of ideas, but our mandate was the same: ordinary people in extraordinary situations, and how do they react? That's what we focused on.
Good. Well, I mean, I haven't seen all of season 3. I'll be honest, but I have seen the episodes that you and Jeremy wrote, and I think there is a consistency there that was lacking in the first 2 seasons.
Thank you.
I'm honest, which is absolutely a good thing. Going into season 3. What was the kind of future of the show at that point? Because I have heard, and do correct me if I'm wrong, that it was just to make up the numbers to sell the series for syndication, or was there a real feeling that this would be going ahead for longer?
No, unfortunately, you're correct in what you've heard. The mandate was CBS had something like 63 or 67, I don't remember exactly, um, half hours that they could cut. Some of the first two seasons that they had were some of the episodes were longer than 30 minutes. Some were much shorter. They had all kinds of different lengths, and they figured that they had enough to have 2/3 of the syndication package, and they wanted us to fill out the package with another 30.
Yeah.
So their plan was to broadcast the 30 in syndication alone as first run during the first year, and then subsequently they would sell the whole package of about 100, more or less 100, I guess it was, as a syndication package from then on. And it played on syndication, I believe 15 to 17 times. I'm not sure how many exactly.
Mm-hmm.
I remember getting residuals for like the 15th run, the 16th run. Now it's running again, and then it ran on cable for a while when it ran on USA, I believe. Now it's running on the US cable. It's an outlet called Chiller.
Yeah.
And it's running currently on that.
Uh-huh.
So they wanted to make it an evergreen show. Twilight Zone is an evergreen show. It doesn't date.
Yeah.
And they wanted to run it as much as possible, which they're doing. They are really milking that property. And they're doing a good job of that.
Yeah.
Not that I make, when they're running on Chiller, I make about $2.50 an episode. Maybe less.
Yeah. It's been running on the Horror Channel in the UK, but for some reason they haven't put season 3 on, which has frustrated a few people. But hopefully they will get that together.
Yeah, I'm sure they will. I mean, they have it's just as cheap for them to run season 3 as it is 1 and 2. So I don't know what their issue is, but maybe they can't run it until they run it on Chiller first, and then they can run it on Horror.
Yeah.
These things are so arcane. Their contracts are so difficult to work out. So.
Yeah.
But you're right. So it was made specifically to run in the syndication market. The fun thing was that it was greeted with great relief that we were going back to the style of the original rather than using the CBS style as a metric.
Good. Well, I'm rather fond of The Trunk. I like that episode a lot. I think it's a wonderful story, but after reading the synopsis, I kind of expected it to be careful what you wish for kind of tale, where the protagonist kind of gets too greedy and something happens for him. But you guys took it in a total, really different direction, which I really like. Could you tell us a bit about that episode?
Well, that's interesting that you say that, because we always tried to take things in a different direction. We didn't always succeed, but we always tried.
Mm-hmm.
And this was an episode that Jeremy came up with. He came in one day and said, what if a guy can get anything he wishes, but he's not a champagne and caviar kind of guy. Mm-hmm. He's just an ordinary character, and his wishes are simple. And I said, hey, that's a good idea. And from there, we started talking, well, where does he work? Where does he find the trunk? How does it happen? And we had logical reasons for him to find the trunk. As you remember, he works in a very, very cheap hotel. He finds the trunk in the room one day, which is a common thing. You find an old suitcase in a hotel room. And he opens it up, and, I wish I had a nickel for every trunk I found. And suddenly there's a trunk full of nickels. So he realizes that he can get whatever he wants. But what he wants are simple things. And this is what the kind of gangsters that inhabit the hotel don't really understand. Why don't you wish for a BMW or something like that?
Yeah.
He doesn't really want that. He just has simple things that he needs to take care of his life. He's happy with his life, more or less. But there is something missing from his life, and that is a woman that cares for him.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a woman that, there's a woman that tries to get with him because she knows that he's got this trunk.
Yeah.
And in the end, it's kind of a twist on that, because he just wants to get away. But when he when the trunk opens up again, it's a woman who has wished for him. So in a strange way, he's gotten his own wish.
I really like it because, he treats the trunk with such respect, doesn't he? He thanks it every time it gives him
Yeah,
something, and in the end, it saves his life, really.
yeah, it does. Saves
Uh-huh.
his life in more than one way.
Yeah.
So it saves his life from those gangsters, and it saves his life in the way that I was just saying, in that he finds his life partner.
Mm-hmm.
They're both happy. She got what she wished for. He got what he wished for. It was the best of all possible outcomes.
Yeah.
Now, Joe wasn't as happy with this episode because it was too happy for him.
Oh.
He didn't like that kind of ending. He thought it was too trite. But the difference in that ending was that they both got what they wished for, and they had very limited tastes and wishes, and that was the thing that he couldn't quite comprehend.
Mm.
Interesting that he had a completely different view of that. But we had the power, and he had his power to do what we wanted to do.
Mm.
When he wrote an episode, Mark would look at it and say, "Okay, make this change and that change." It was very, very few changes to either of us, and we had the same thing. Nobody had dominion over anybody else. It was just Mark would decide. First, he would decide, "Yes, we're going to do that," and then after that, it would be like, can his coat be green instead of yellow? And that was about it. So
Yeah.
we had, first and last time, I had complete freedom of creativity on television, which is, as you know, is pretty rare
Mm.
unless you're the showrunner. And even then, you have to deal with the network. And we had to deal with the network. Believe me, we still had to deal with the network. But the network being MGM at the time, MGM was the producing network, and then the CBS would distribute it internationally, and MGM would distribute it domestically.
I see.
So we had nodes from the network, and sometimes they were so ridiculous as to be just crazy. But sometimes we had to answer them, and we would, and then they would say, "Oh, okay." That's the way we went. So it was pretty good. It
Yeah.
was,
Well, that brings me quite nicely onto my next question because Room 2426, I think, probably my favourite of your episodes.
oh, thanks. That was my favorite too.
Yeah, it's a very challenging piece,
Mm.
and performed really well, and the audience does have to. Excuse me. The audience does have to sit up and take notice, which is to the story's credit. Did you get many notes on that one? How did they accept that one?
I'm not sure they understood what was going on there. uh, they thought that he had the true power of the ability to move himself from one place to the other.
Yeah.
The only issues that we had were like, why was this guy in jail? And we said, well, he's in jail for thinking, for having different thoughts,
Mm.
for being revolutionary in his thinking. And there are a group of people that are like that, and he's living in a dictatorship.
Yeah.
It came out of a situation, an experience that I had in Spain, and I lived in Spain under Franco for 2 years.
Mm.
And so I was the only person in the room that knew what it was like to live under a dictatorship and to understand what it was to have your thoughts and your media controlled or attempted to be controlled. I mean, I would go down to the newsstand. I used to like to read the Herald American. And I would go down to the newsstand and wouldn't be there that day. And I'd say, well, what happened? And the guy would look at me and go, so you know what happened.
Mm.
And that would mean that it had been confiscated because it had something about Spain. Or I
Right.
would go down and buy Time magazine, there would be a page missing, and I'd say, what happened? And he'd look at me, and you know what happened. And I also lived there during a time when there was martial law, and gatherings of more than three people needed a permit. So
Wow.
by three people, I mean if you went to a party and you weren't related to the people that were at the party, you had to have a permit.
Yeah.
So that kind of oppression and oppression of thought got me thinking, well, what if you could just fool them? And I knew that there were interrogators that tried to fool people into
Mm.
thinking they were their friends. And that's why I threw this interrogator, Joseph, into the cell with our hero. And our hero was smart enough to figure out that he was being fooled eventually, and not right away, but eventually he figured out that he was being fooled.
Yeah.
And I just wanted to prove that the power of mind could defeat a dictatorship.
Uh-huh.
And
Uh-huh.
eventually, meaning an idea could bring down a whole country, which it can. We know it. We know that it's happened.
Yeah.
And I just wanted to show that in a more metaphorical way.
Yeah. Yeah. Great episode. So were there any stories that you didn't get round to telling that you would have loved to have made?
Oh gosh, yeah, there were tons of stories that we pitched, several stories. One that comes to mind was one that we sold to the CBS guys,
Hmm.
and they ended up not doing it. And it's about a waitress who's struggling to make it, and she's serving a guy who looks a lot like Orson Welles, who was alive at the time still.
Yeah.
And he says, you can make it if you want to make it. You know, if you really want to make it, you put yourself out there, and instead of being stuck here as a waitress and doing all your work. And she didn't believe him. She went into the kitchen and to get his meal. When she came out, she was on stage. So, and she couldn't believe that either. She went back into the kitchen, and the kitchen was the kitchen. And then she went back out, and there was the guy sitting there. And he said, "I told you, if you really believe, you can do it."
Yeah.
And we went through that a little bit, and eventually they were going to do it, but it was a short, and it was one of those like 15-minute ones, and they
I
decided
see.
that was going to be for their next season. And of course, they didn't have a next season, and it was too short for us to do. And we decided that we weren't going to do that. There was another one about a man who is exploring a pyramid and gets down into the bowels of the pyramid and sees English writing on the wall. And he says, how did that happen? Because this has been sealed for the last 3,000 years. And it goes into that situation where he finds there's another cavity that he can squeeze into. The English writing says, go back.
Uh-huh.
And he finds out that when he gets into the next room, he is transported into Egypt of 3,500 years ago.
Right.
And in the end, I'm going to tell you the story because it never got made. In the end, he was the one that wrote "Go Back"
Oh,
because
right.
he got stuck there and he was sacrificed with the pharaoh because he was one of the people that was in the tomb. You know that the servants and many other people were laid with the pharaoh to be sacrificed so that they would be there when
Uh-huh.
he woke up in the next world. And so he turned out to be one of Pharaoh's slaves. That was the kind of stuff we just thought, what would happen if? And that was our biggest, that was the key to our episodes. What would happen if this and what would happen if that? And we'd start with that, and then we'd figure out what would happen to this particular person. What kind of person would that happen to, and what would he do?
Yeah.
It's all about the idea and then the people. It's all about the people.
Well, now you're contributing to these ebooks from Digital Fabulists, which we've checked out and they're great. So, how's it been revisiting these stories? How do you think they hold up?
Well, that's interesting. I think they do hold up.
Uh huh.
We tried to write them as timeless stories and people in situations that would recur in any time period. So that wasn't just things that are going on in society now. They're issues that people deal with and have been dealing with for hundreds and thousands of years. And I think they're holding up pretty well. As a matter of fact, I'm going to be using them. I'm now teaching at Loyola Marymount University in their film school.
Uh huh.
And I'm going to be teaching them in a class on introduction to screenwriting for non-majors. So they're not going to be writing full-length features. They're just going to be writing 10 to 15-minute shorts. And I'm going to be using these as examples of how you can tell a complete story in 22 minutes and 30 seconds, which
Yeah.
is what we did. And that's including titles. So it's really 20 minutes. And it's just close enough to be used as an example.
Uh huh.
There's a beginning, a middle, and an end. So I'm very happy with these stories. I think it's great that they're getting out there again and that there are people willing to read them. And they're so easy to take down off the net. I mean, for a couple of bucks, you've got a Twilight Zone script. One of the reasons that we decided to do that is that in the 80s, or was it the early 90s, the scripts were published by Harvest Moon,
Uh huh.
and we had a short-term contract with them. They went out of business, and so the scripts that they published were being traded on eBay, and some of them got up to first they were $50, and then they were $100, and then one of them got up to $1,000. And I said,
Oh,
Hey,
wow.
I'm not making any money on that. Why should they make $1,000 to turn over a piece of my work that I truly own? So
Yeah.
we decided to go with Digital Fabulous. When they came to us with that idea, we said, that's fantastic. Let's do that.
Great, great. So I take it we're going to be seeing a lot more.
Well, I'm hoping, I've talked to some of the other writers I know from Twilight Zone. They're putting their things up there. Robert Walden, who wrote an episode. Robert Walden was an actor who was the star of one of the shows that I worked on called Brothers, which was just before Twilight Zone. Before I was on staff on Twilight Zone, it wasn't before I wrote the episode Aquavita.
Uh-huh.
Uh, and Ralph Phillips and a couple of other people are going up there. So we're hoping to get most of them. I don't know if Joe will do this or not, but
Yeah.
the likelihood is not. So we'll
Uh-huh.
see. Do what we can.
Going back a little, I mean, you were creating a show that many would argue was so strongly linked to Rod Serling that, to continue it would be Twilight Zone in name only. What would your response to that be, do you think?
Well, my response, first of all, is that Rod had an open policy when he was working on the show. He wasn't the only writer. He wrote a lot of the episodes, there's no doubt about it.
Mm-hmm.
But he also hired several other writers.
Yeah.
Uh, and in doing that, he allowed them the freedom to create what they wanted to create, as long as it was a Twilight Zone episode, meaning as long as it had an ordinary person in an extraordinary situation
Mm-hmm.
with a twist. And so we thought, well, that mandate is large enough for us to fit under the umbrella of, to mix as many metaphors as I can.
Mm-hmm.
And we thought there's no reason why we couldn't do this. And his widow said, that's fine with us, and why not?
Yeah.
And we used, as a matter of fact, we also used some scripts that had been originally written for the CBS version.
Mm-hmm.
We used one or two of those, which we thought were really good. And we were sorry that they didn't make it onto that CBS version because it would have helped
Yeah.
stay on the air, we thought. And one of the reasons that it went off the air was because it started doing that thing where they were explaining on the blackboard what was going on.
Mm.
And, you lose your audience when you get away from people and you're onto chalk and board. It's not a good idea. So we didn't feel any compunction about doing these. We just felt honored, but we also felt a responsibility
Yeah.
to be as close in style and nature as we possibly could to those original ones. We were in
Mm.
color, that was a big difference. But and we had to shoot in Canada, and that was another difference. And we can go into that sometime if you want. But we felt we were hoping that then MGM would say, "Hey, why don't you do another 30?"
Mm.
But they had their plan, and that was the plan, and they weren't going to change it. And they were very successful with it. I don't know why they didn't change it. And eventually, then it got on to they did another series of them for UPN, which unfortunately was really not what it should have been. Let's just say that.
Yeah, yeah. I've seen a few of those. A little unfortunate. Which the thing is, we all love the Twilight Zone, but it always seems to be quite a turbulent kind of show when it's on the air. Even the original show, the head was pretty much always on the chopping block. It was always kind of this close to being cancelled.
Yeah, it
I
wasn't a
mean,
tremendously popular show. I was just going to say it wasn't. Was no I Love Lucy. It wasn't in the top shows,
mm,
but it had a loyal following. The people that followed it stayed with it.
yeah,
But
yeah,
it wasn't, McHale's Navy or something like that.
yeah. I mean, as someone who has worked in the business for some years, and I know you still work in the business,
Hmm.
you advise a lot on script writing and that kind of thing. Is that right?
Yeah, I've been consulting with Screen West Australia and Screen Australia and individuals. I consulted not too long ago on a script with Will Smith.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I do a lot of that, but I'm also still writing. I have a project that's got Richard Karn attached.
Mm-hmm.
Richard Karn was the tool guy in Tim Allen's comedy, whose name is skipping right now.
Mm-hmm.
And
Home
I've got some
improvement.
Home Improvement, thank you.
Yeah.
And I've got something else that is out to Shania Twain, of all people, because I think it's something that Jeremy and I wrote originally for American Playhouse. that we think Shania can play and would be helpful to the project
Yeah.
about Native Americans. So, yeah, I'm still in the business, still active in the business, but more so, I'm working with people and consulting in the business, not just my students, but other people. So
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
have my hand all over the place.
Absolutely. So, you know the business kind of inside and out. Do you think that, there's always talk of a new Twilight Zone? Do you think that that is a real possibility that it could be revived and be both critically and commercially successful, or do you think that we're just living in a different time now and it's not really something that a modern audience wants to see?
Wow, it's hard to say. The networks are so crazy right now, and the cable networks are so nuts,
Mm-hmm.
and they don't really know what they're doing. They're trying to find their audience, and they're trying to find it with the same old stuff. So
Mm-hmm.
if some guy wakes up over at CBS one day and says, "You know what we really could do? We could do the Twilight Zone again." It could happen, but they are very, very cautious about anthology shows
Yeah.
because they want to create a continuing audience with a continuing story and they want to hook you in somehow. They don't believe that the franchise of Twilight Zone is enough to hook people in. They think that people need a story and continuing characters to do that.
Mm-hmm.
That's what's up for debate.
Yeah.
And I can debate that until I'm blue, but they can point at numbers and I can say, well, look, it might not be Two and a Half Men in terms of continuing story and continuing audience.
Mm-hmm.
But if it's a cable outlet, let's say it's USA or let's say it's a cable outlet owned by CBS, which would be like MTV or um, uh, there's not FX, but FX would be a perfect place for it. There's another one that's owned that appeals directly to men. That could be a possibility. So you don't
Mm-hmm.
need the huge audience. If you do it on a budget, you don't have to make these for $1 million.
Yeah.
They made Aquavita for about $1 million. That was a lot of money then
Mm-hmm.
for a half hour.
Yeah.
And it doesn't need to be done that way. That was CBS when they were making it. That was Phil DeGuere's Spendthrift Days. We made our episodes for a good deal less than that, but they can still be made given the changes in production and the way production is done with video and HD stuff. We could still make these episodes for under $250,000
Yeah.
with a lot of care and focus on the story more than on the production values and those kinds of things. Keep them small. They had quite small stories. If you look at them, they didn't have these big science fiction things. They had small things
Mm-hmm.
that were easily done in a studio, and we could do the same. But I have to convince the people at the top, and they don't want to listen about that. And I don't
Yeah.
have the rights to do that. So the rights are tied up with Carol Serling and that estate, and I just don't have that.
Paul, I just got one final question.
Sure.
And, I'd like to finish by asking you about something that you and Jeremy arranged that I think all Twilight Zone fans owe you a debt of gratitude for. Hopefully, you know what I mean.
Oh yeah. Okay. Well, thank you. We had realized our office was on Hollywood Boulevard, and we realized that there were very, very few writers that didn't have a star on the Walk of Fame.
Mm-hmm.
That had a star, excuse me, that had a star. And we thought, that's kind of stupid because the only people that have to work from the nothing are the writers, and then everybody else works from that. And they're the creators of the whole thing. And then we realized, too, that there was no star for Rod Serling.
Mm-hmm.
And that was just a travesty as far as we were concerned. Here's a guy that won many Emmy Awards. He won Emmys before Twilight Zone. I believe he won Emmys after Twilight Zone.
Mm-hmm.
Very powerful writer in the business, very influential to writers since. And he didn't have his own star. And there were people that had stars that we didn't recognize. We didn't recognize their names. We didn't even recognize what they did. And as a matter of fact, we found out when we were researching that one of the persons that had a star on the Walk of Fame was just somebody's secretary.
Oh, wow.
And, yeah, so we realized that it wasn't as hard to get a star on there as we thought. It required the company that wanted to put forward a particular person to put up a certain amount of money. I believe at the time it was $5,000, and create an event around that. So we arranged that to happen, and that was quite an impressive day.
Yeah, good, good. Okay, very deserving, absolutely.
Mm.
Okay, well, Paul, it's been a pleasure. I really thank you for giving us your insight on the 80s series, and it's been a real honor for me. So thanks for talking to me today.
Oh, well, thank you, Tom. It was great to talk with you, and I loved your questions. It really got to the heart of the matter, so that always makes the interview a lot more interesting.
So there you go. That was Paul Chitlik, and I really want to say thanks again to Paul. It was a real pleasure getting to speak to him. And like I say, if you want to check out those ebooks, then you can go to digitalfabulists.com and check them out. There's also a link to them at the Twilight Zone network if you want to go and check that out too. So in the next podcast, we'll be back to our usual format, and we'll be talking about The Monsters Are Due on Maple Street. Once again, I'd like to give my apologies for the schedule of the podcast lately. It hasn't been what I would like it to be, but unfortunately my workload at the moment just stops that from happening. But rest assured, it will get back to normal one day, and in the meantime I will do my best to get episodes out when I can. But stick with me, we've got a good show coming up next, and I think everyone's going to enjoy that. So once again, thanks for listening, and thank you to Paul, and I'll see you next time.